On Primetime Politics tonight, as the House rises for the summer, the government faces another grilling over allegations of political interference in the investigation of the Nova Scotia mass shooting, on a day when the Prime Minister expresses full confidence in the RCMP Commissioner. MPs will be here to debate the search for answers and accountability. MPs return to their constituencies and to face families struggling with record inflation. I'll speak with this economist about what's ahead and the measures being taken to deal with the affordability crisis. And our panel of party commentators on the parliamentary sitting, the big stories, and what comes next. But we'll begin tonight with more government denials of political interference in the investigation into Canada's largest mass shooting. In the final question period of the spring sitting, opposition parties continued to pepper the government benches with demands for answers after evidence that suggests RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki interfered in the investigation in an effort to promote the government's gun control agenda. That evidence is in the form of notes taken by a Nova Scotia RCMP superintendent during a conference call in April 2020 with Commissioner Lucki, 10 days after the mass shooting that left 22 people dead. His notes made public at the inquiry into the shooting say that Commissioner Lucki told the RCMP officers gathered for that conference call that she had promised the Minister of Public Safety and the Prime Minister's office that the force would disclose the type of firearms used in the mass shooting because it would advance the government's pending gun control legislation. Investigators on the case had refused to disclose the types of weapons for fear that would undermine the investigation. Well, today the Prime Minister at the Commonwealth Summit in Rwanda was asked about the allegations.
We did not put any undue influence or pressure. It is extremely important to highlight that it is only the RCMP, it is only police that determine what and when to release information. The Commissioner's statement, the Minister's statement were very clear on that. And yes, I still very much have confidence in Commissioner Lucki.
Well, MPs on the Commons Public Safety Committee have voted to hold a hearing at the end of July on the allegations of political interference. Let's follow up on those allegations with three members of Parliament. Greg Fergus is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. Raquel Dancho is the Public Safety Critic for the official opposition Conservatives. And Alistair MacGregor is the Public Safety Critic for the NDP. Good to see you all. Mr. Fergus, the Prime Minister said today, quote, "We did not put any undue influence or pressure on the RCMP." And I think that's an interesting choice of words, no undue influence or pressure, which seems to suggest there was some form of interaction with the RCMP Commissioner, but that in the Prime Minister's view it was not undue pressure or influence. How should we interpret the Prime Minister's remarks today?
You should interpret it very simply. The Prime Minister, of course, and the Minister of Public Safety at the time would have received regular updates from the Commissioner of the RCMP as part of her regular functions in a tragedy of this sort. We have to remember this is the largest mass casualty event that we've had in Canada. It was a tragedy for the people of Portapique, Nova Scotia, indeed for all Canadians. And as a result, of course, there were regular briefings that was provided for from time to time. But I think it's important that we stay on the facts. And the facts is that there is a very thick line between political responsibility and police independence.
Well, that's if I can jump, that's the expectation, but according to Superintendent Campbell, that's not what happened here. That he's suggesting in the notes he kept that line was crossed.
I think it's important. I can't comment on what happened at that meeting within the RCMP, but I certainly can comment on what has happened from what was involved from the standpoint from the Prime Minister, standpoint from the Minister of Public Security and their teams. There was no political interference.
Okay, Raquel,
there was no direction which was given.
Okay, let me move to your colleagues. Your time is tight. So Raquel Dancho, how do you interpret the Prime Minister's denials today of any undue influence or pressure on the RCMP Commissioner?
Well, let's just be clear, Peter. The superintendent for the Nova Scotia RCMP and others gave legal testimony that there was political interference from the Prime Minister's office and from the Minister of Public Safety into a criminal investigation into the worst mass killing in Canadian history in order to advance the Liberal agenda. Now, Mr. Campbell, since this story broke, has been publicly backed by the former commissioner of the RCMP, a former deputy commissioner of the RCMP, and a former superintendent of the RCMP.
To be clear, they've backed up his qualifications and his character. They haven't backed up the statements.
As I said, that's what I said. They backed up his integrity since that story broke. So just to be clear, that's the three most highest-ranking RCMP, former RCMP officials in this country have come out backing the integrity of Darren Campbell. As I said, Darren Campbell and others gave legal testimony to say that there was political interference from the Prime Minister's office and the Minister of Public Safety. And I would like to say, Peter, that the Liberals continue to deny that there was any wrongdoing. However, today at committee, they had the opportunity to be transparent and bring members from the Prime Minister's office to testify at committee, but they blocked that.
Okay.
So they had nothing to hide. Why would they avoid accountability?
I want to get to more of that, but Mr. MacGregor, first, what do you make of the Prime Minister's denials today?
Well, we have two stories going on here, and I just know from personal experience when I use handwritten notes, I'm often writing notes for myself when I'm at committee so that I can accurately follow along with what I'm hearing from witnesses. There's no reason to believe that the handwritten notes that were submitted as official evidence are in any way wrong. I think we have to attach some truth to them. And furthermore, the person who wrote them, Superintendent Campbell, he has had his character and integrity backed up by some very high-ranking former RCMP officers. I know they have not spoken about the handwritten notes, but if the man's integrity is being spoken up for by several high-ranking officers, I don't see why there's any reason to doubt the veracity of those notes. And so we have two competing narratives, which is leaving us with a lot more questions than answers. And I think, in respect to the families of the loved ones that they lost in Nova Scotia, we deserve some answers on whether there was, in fact, any involvement from the PMO, as was alleged in these handwritten notes. These are the questions we need to have answers to.
Mr. Fergus, some of those answers may come at the Public Safety Committee. It voted today, as we've heard, to hold hearings into the allegations, and will call the RCMP Commissioner to testify, as well as Superintendent Campbell, whose notes we've discussed triggered the allegations, and Bill Blair, who was the Minister of Public Safety at the time. How valuable do you think that process will be?
I think that process will be very valuable. However, if Canadians want to make sure that there is no political interest at stake, I would put as much, or perhaps more, depending on your perspective, emphasis on the Mass Casualty Commission, which is being led by, of course, Justice MacDonald from the former Nova Scotia Superior Court. I think we want to make sure that, I know that the Commissioner of the RCMP has announced that she is going to testify under oath at that commission. There will also the commission has come to no conclusions. They had just released the testimony as the testimony becomes available. So I'd like to see the commission do its work in its disinterested way that it's been doing it so far, to bring a sense of closure to the people of Portapique, the people of Nova Scotia, and the people of Canada.
Okay, Raquel Dancho, as a member of the Public Safety Committee, the hearings won't happen for another month. I think you wanted to call an official, you wanted the hearings to happen more quickly, and you also wanted, as you touched on, to call an official from the Prime Minister's office. That request was rejected. Why do you think it's so important to hear from the PMO in this?
Both the NDP and the Conservatives were pushing to have these meetings begin next week. It's important that we get to the bottom of this. Canadians and the victims' families in Nova Scotia deserve to know the truth about this. And the inquiry that Mr. Fergus mentioned, that is investigating, that is not investigating the political interference. That is the job of Parliament and members of the Public Safety Committee. It is our duty to hold the government accountable. There has been extreme and shocking statements made that has come through the inquiry that we are now looking to investigate. It is our duty to do so. Unfortunately, because of the Liberal members of the committee, we will not be able to hear from members of the Prime Minister's office, despite them being mentioned by Mr. Campbell and by others from the Casualty Commission's reports. So again, it's roadblocks, it's fleeing transparency, it's avoiding accountability, it's denying and deflecting yet again from this Liberal government. It's what we saw with SNC-Lavalin, it's what we saw with the We Charity scandal. They have a pattern of doing this, Peter, and but we will do everything we can as members of the opposition to hold them accountable and get answers for Canadians.
Mr. MacGregor, do you believe that something's lost here by the hearings not happening for another month? And what questions will you be looking to have answered at those hearings? And again, why is there a month delay to hold them?
Yeah, no, my preference was, along with Raquel, to have them next week, but it did not appear that we had the votes to achieve that. So, her Conservative colleague, Dane Lloyd, actually came up with a compromise and suggested later on in July. It's not as soon as I have liked, but, we have to work with what we've got with our colleagues along the table. And I would agree with Raquel that, the inquiry, that the Commission has a very specific task. It's looking at how the events of April 18th and 19th unfolded. Our parliamentary committee is going to be very much interested in a phone call, a conference call that occurred over a week after that. And the allegations that the commissioner was trying to pressure the Nova Scotia RCMP to release information during an ongoing investigation that was in defense and would have helped along any proposed Liberal gun legislation. That's the political angle, and that's the role that members of the opposition have in holding the government to account.
Mr. Fergus, given where this story is right now, the Prime Minister said today he's got confidence in the RCMP Commissioner, but should Canadians have confidence in the Commissioner while this story continues to unfold?
I think they should have confidence until they have evidence to suggest otherwise. And give the RCMP Commissioner Lucky an opportunity to speak to the MacDonald inquiry and also to the Public Security Committee when she's invited to do so.
All right, so you
at
have
the end of the month.
Confidence for, and very quick answers as well from Raquel Dancho and Mr. MacGregor. Raquel Dancho, confidence in the RCMP Commissioner?
We've already heard her statement, and you'll notice in her statement, Peter, she didn't address what was found in the witness testimony from Mr. Campbell and others, that there was political interference from the Prime Minister's office and from Minister Bill Blair. So the pressure is certainly high on Minister Blair, his officials. Again, we wish we could hear from the Prime Minister's office. Unfortunately, we don't have that option at this time. Right. But we have confidence in our ability to do the best that we can to get to the bottom of this. But if Liberal members of the committee continue to roadblock transparency, Peter, there's not a lot that we can do unless we have the vote. So I urge
Mr.
my
MacGregor,
bloc colleagues
Mr. MacGregor,
to
do you
work
have
with us on
confidence? Do you have confidence in the Commissioner?
I can't render a judgment right now one way or the other. We have more questions than answers, and I think it's incumbent upon the RCMP Commissioner to appear before our committee and really clear the air. We really have to get down to the bottom of what transpired in this whole affair.
All right. Thank you all for your time tonight, and we'll continue to follow the story. Do appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, as MPs leave Parliament Hill behind for the summer, they return to ridings where families are trying to cope with soaring costs and serious affordability challenges, fueling a relentless climb in record-setting inflation driven by higher costs for gas, food, and by supply chain problems. Inflation hit 7.7% last month. The government claims its economic measures will help. Conservatives want cuts to the gas taxes and a suspension of the federal carbon tax. New Democrats have called for an increase for low-income families in the GST rebates and child tax benefits. But how much can governments do, and what should Canadians expect to see in the weeks ahead? Ian Lee is an associate professor at the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University. Professor Lee, thanks for joining me. It's good to see you again. Look, there's certainly the sticker shock each month as inflation hits another high, and that's not just a number. It represents serious hardship for many families. How much worse should we expect inflation to get, and for how long?
I actually think, Peter, that we're nearing the peak. And I say that because when you deconstruct or decompose the inflation rate, we know that the single largest driver is energy, and more precisely oil, and more precisely gasoline. Well, I don't think there's any serious forecaster predicting that oil is going to run up again yet more from 115 WTI per barrel to 140 or 150 or 180. So I think that the oil is pretty well at the upper level, which suggests that that's not going to continue to drive inflation going forward. And then secondly, I agree with Governor Macklem that the supply chain disruptions are going to come back into balance. They do take time. I will not use that word transitory because I don't know when. But
Right.
the nature of supply and demand when you have shortages is that market forces will bring them back into balance over time. So I think by the end of this year, 2022, I'm not suggesting prices are going to drop through the floor, but I think it will have plateaued and maybe be declining a little bit.
Okay, what do you see as the role of the federal government in helping to dampen inflation, and how is this government fulfilling that role?
Of course, the government has a role. It has a twofold role, really. One's fiscal policy, of course, which is the Minister of Finance and government spending and all the things that government does through its myriad government departments. And then on the more structural medium term, of course, it has monetary policy and interest rates. So let me deal with the latter first, because I think that interest rates are much more effective, have a much bigger impact on the entire economy because they are such a blunt instrument. And Peter, I lived through the 70s. I was a young man in my 20s. I was a mortgage manager at the Bank of Montreal beside the National Press Club opposite the West Block of Parliament Hill. And I lent millions and millions of dollars in that period when inflation went from 4, then it went to 5, to 7, to 8, to 10. Eventually it peaked, I believe it was at 14, and they drove interest rates up to 20%. Now, we produced a horrible recession, the worst since the Great Depression, but it absolutely destroyed and eliminated inflation for the next 30, 35 years. I'm not advocating that. I'm not suggesting we're going down that road, but interest rates do work. They do suppress demand. They do kill inflation if you push them up high enough.
Okay, let me.
That's on the monetary side.
Well, okay, quickly on the government side.
Quickly on the government side, I think it's more, I don't want to call it cosmetic, but it's more temporary Band-Aid type relief. You can do targeted relief. You can do a gas tax suspension, as they've just done in the States for, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. Or you can target it, as the NDP is suggesting, to low, modest income people. But that's really it's a Band-Aid. And I mean by a Band-Aid, it's not dealing with the underlying structural drivers that's creating the inflation.
All right. So the essential role for the Bank of Canada is to try and get back to that inflation target rate of 2 or 3%, and it's pushing up borrowing rates quickly to try and get there. Some have suggested the bank could move more slowly to cushion the shock. What's your view?
I've been critical publicly, Peter, since April 2021. I was critical of both the Bank of Canada and the Government of Canada because when you looked at the data, and the data that Ms. Freeland, as the finance minister, was bragging about, properly so, in the 2021 budget, that's over a year ago, right? And she was saying, look, our economy's booming, it's up to 6% GDP, we've recovered all the jobs. And I kept saying in my comments to my own students, I was quoting Supertramp, that great line, that great song, crisis. What crisis? In other words, we had recovered from an economic point of view. I wasn't denying that people weren't getting COVID and people weren't getting sick. But from a GDP point of view, employment point of view, growth point of view, we were pandemic, and there was no longer a need for fiscal stimulus, which is what large deficits are, and the interest rates were far too low. And I was warning then that inflation, where they were going to let the inflation genie out of the bottle, as we did in the late 70s, and it's a lot harder to put it back in the bottle once it's out of the bottle. Okay,
very quickly, we've only got about 20 seconds left here. Do you believe we're headed for a recession?
I don't think so. It's not the 70s, notwithstanding I just said that. One huge difference. Back then, there were millions of young boomers, and many couldn't find jobs, very high unemployment. Today, we have the exact opposite situation, massive labor shortages. It's going to be a tough 12 to 18 months, but I don't think we're going to tip into a recession.
All right. Ian Lee, always good to get your perspective. Thanks again for providing it tonight. Take care.
My pleasure, Peter. Thank you.
Well, I'm joined now by our panel of political commentators. Susan Smith is a Liberal commentator, Tim Powers is a Conservative commentator, and Kim Wright is an NDP commentator. Good to see you all. Thanks for being here. Susan, look, the government's facing this firestorm over the allegations of political interference in the RCMP investigation into the mass shootings in Halifax. Are there questions that need to be answered here, and what's the best way to get at them?
Well, I think your main word is allegations, Peter, and I think you have to look at where the questions are coming from, and they're coming from the opposition, who are trying to make any hey, they can in the final days before things rise for the summer. There is an ongoing investigation about what happened in that tragic window of time with Portapique, where 22 people were shot. I think it's fair to say that people have many questions for how that entire incident unfolded, and that's where the questions should be. What happened? Why were people delayed in notifications? How did this man accumulate what he accumulated? Right. And those are the questions that are being asked by the inquiry, and those are the questions.
Right, but opposition MPs are asking questions based on the notes provided by a senior superintendent of the RCMP suggesting that there was political interference. So, isn't there a basis for these questions?
I haven't seen the superintendent's notes. I think it's legitimate to ask. There are questions that can be asked in the wake of such a terrible, tragic incident. Whether someone's notes or someone's interpretation of some freelancing that's written on the side, I don't know. I wasn't there. I wasn't in the room. But I think the main issue is getting to the bottom of what happened in Portapique and making sure it doesn't happen ever again. All
right. Tim, the Public Safety Committee will hold at least one hearing at the end of July with the RCMP Commissioner, Bill Blair, and the Nova Scotia RCMP Superintendent at the center of this story. How big of a problem do you think this is for the government?
It's a big problem for the government because it isn't the opposition that brought this forward. It was the Halifax Examiner, and in examining the mass casualty report, who found Superintendent Campbell's notes. There's no equivocation in those notes. And you've since had former Commissioner Paulson, former Deputy Commissioner, Assistant Commissioner Boudreau, and others come out and say, Superintendent Campbell, he's a credible person. One, I think, described him as the most effective major crimes investigator in Canada. So you can't just dismiss that. That's serious. And whether Commissioner Lucky stepped forward and said things she shouldn't have had. There were other people in that room, apparently. This needs to have more than the Public Safety Committee look at it, because what Superintendent Campbell wrote about what he believed happened in that meeting is pretty concerning, right, if he is accurate.
Well, there's all kinds of course, the story has all kinds of sort of legs to it and layers to it. And we did get a statement from the RCMP commissioner, but it's worth, I think, Kim pointing out that in her statement, Brenda Lucky never takes issue with what Darren Campbell, the superintendent, says she said at the meeting. She talks about a different approach and some of the concerns has been raised, but she never says what he said isn't true. So what's your view on what's happening here?
Yeah, and that's a very big distinction, Peter, that she's not suggesting it isn't accurate. This isn't a situation, as the Prime Minister likes to say, where somebody experienced something differently. We are talking about a major mass shooting. But then subsequently, the government decided to once again bring out the specter of potentially doing something about guns in this country, handgun bans and assault rifle bans, and none of it actually gets done. And what we see time after time will be that, here, let's be distracted over here. We'll talk about regulations and gun crimes and not get to actually the problem, which is some serious questionable judgment that had led up to that mass shooting and subsequent to it. So there's a lot of things that we need to look at within the RCMP. A couple of summers ago, Bill Blair was supposed to go back and do some homework about an overhaul of the RCMP and how they deal with Indigenous communities, what's happening with missing and murdered Indigenous women. We've had, a few more come up since then, and none of this gets done. So that's where people get really frustrated and really angry. Okay. But the fact that there's nothing changing is still very questionable to me.
So we'll have some form of hearings. Not sure exactly how long they'll be, but that'll happen later in July. But Susan, let me switch here to talk about, there's lots of things we could talk about the spring sitting, but I think the sort of reigning feature of the spring sitting was the Liberal NDP supply and confidence deal. It was clearly a key feature of the last number of months, given that it took the threat of a snap election off the table. How do you believe it's delivered better governance for Canadians?
I do believe it's delivered better governance for Canadians. I think one of the key features of the spring sitting were the horns honking and the bouncy castles and hay bales on fire in front of Parliament Hill on Wellington Street. As a result of that, or one of the outcomes of that, were increased conversations between the Prime Minister and Jagmeet Singh, and they did this agreement. And I think what it's done is create some stability, some ability for runway for good public policy decisions to be made, not with one eye on election footing, but an eye on all eyes on best public policy. I think it's going to allow the temperature in the country to come down, given the heated rhetoric around the conservative leadership that isn't dialing down. That temperature continues to be turned up, especially by the front runner. So I think it's a good deal. I think it's a good idea it's provided good opportunity for Canadians. And when you see things like dental care, and when that comes to fruition, that will be a concrete result of the agreement. Okay.
Tim, what do you see as the key impact of the Liberal NDP deal during this sitting, and how has it affected the role of the official opposition?
I think I will agree there's predictability. I don't necessarily think that predictability will be of 3 years duration, because I think different sorts of politics will take over. So that's an immediate impact. I do wonder, Peter, if it's created complacency in the Liberals, because the Liberals in the last number of weeks have had all manner of mistake made, usually by themselves, and seem not to be too flustered about that. Maybe it's because they feel they have the security of the NDP and they don't have to be as determined as they once were. But we've had, ministers like Mendicino, Minister Joly, Minister Alghabra, who've all struggled at different times and have not created their behavior among them, a great sense of competency in the Canadian public. For the Conservatives, I think it's a bit frustrating. But there also may be some benefit they're not realizing yet, that it keeps them from ridiculous overstating and posturing on elections right now, because I do agree with Susan. I don't think people want that right now, but I think they feel it's a bit limiting in any threat they utter, because they know where the NDP are currently aligned.
Okay. Kim Wright, some might argue that giving the minority government a guarantee of up to 3 years might actually slow down action on key issues. Tim sort of alluded to that. How much more action on NDP priorities might we be seeing if the NDP had not abandoned the threat of bringing down the government?
Yeah, look, I will absolutely unreservedly do not believe we would have seen a substantial movement on dental care. I think we would have seen press releases, but I don't think we would have seen it in the budget or substantial. And why do I say that? Because the Liberals took it out of their platform last election, even though they had it in before. So here's what I know, that's in there. This is an ongoing conversation. And if the government thinks that they get to completely ignore the New Democrats and those conversations they should be having in a minority government on the priorities of Canadians, they do so at their peril. Look, this is an ongoing discussion. And like any relationship, when you stop wooing your partners, it's going to get ugly.
All right. A lot to ask here, but just 20 seconds or so each. Just what are you watching for in the next couple of months here while Parliament's not here? What's the big story to keep an eye on? Susan?
I think it's the Conservative leadership Leslyn Lewis was meeting with convoy people inside Parliament Hill yesterday, and 9 other Conservative MPs, keeping an eye on the front-runner, Pierre Poilievre. And for me, it's how big a hole can he dig himself in terms of outrageous and outlandish statements that he makes, that we then get to hold him to account for if he's the guy that's crossed first over the finish line.
Tim, big story you're watching.
Yeah, I think it's leadership. And the second one, Peter, is the Liberal government reboot. Is there a big cabinet shuffle coming? Because as I said a moment ago, they have some performance challenges they need to address. Okay.
Kim, what about you?
Couple of things. Mostly, that poll that we saw floating around out of Main Street around Pierre Poilievre not being able to win his own seat. Is Pierre Poilievre the Stephen Del Duca of federal politics? Who knows? But we're going to see this play out over the barbecue circuit, first and foremost at Stampede, when you've got UCP candidates and Conservative leadership. Lots of barbecues. Okay.
Who doesn't like a barbecue? Thank you all for your time tonight. Really appreciate it. And we'll talk again. Have a great summer.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
And that is all for another edition of Primetime Politics on CPAC. I'm Peter Van Dusen. Thanks for watching.